Russia built the 107th Arsenal to last a century. Reinforced concrete 3 meters thick, bunkers designed to survive direct hits from tactical weapons, located 380 kilometers inside Russian territory, far beyond what Moscow considered Ukraine's operational reach. Then, in the early hours of a spring morning, all of that stopped mattering. Subscribe, like, drop a comment, and let's see exactly how it happened. At 3:47 a.m. local time, seismic monitoring stations across Eastern Europe registered an event, not an earthquake, a detonation sequence, magnitude 3.2 on the Richter scale. The source wasn't a fault line. It was Toropets, a small district in Russia's Tver Oblast, population 11,000, home to one of the largest active ammunition depots still operating from Soviet-era infrastructure, the 107th Arsenal. 7.5 square kilometers of fortified storage, 42 reinforced bunkers, capacity for over 3,000 tons of military ordnance at any given time. On this particular morning, it held approximately 2,000 tons, artillery shells, rockets, guided missiles, small arms ammunition, everything the Russian military needed to sustain operations across the southern front for the next 6 months. Within 40 minutes, most of it was gone. Residents in Toropets woke to windows shattering, not cracking, shattering inward from overpressure. Car alarms triggered across the district simultaneously. Every dog in a 5-kilometer radius began howling. 8 kilometers east, the sky had turned orange. Satellite thermal imaging later confirmed surface temperatures exceeding 1,500 degrees Celsius at multiple points across the facility, hot enough to ignite secondary fires in surrounding vegetation, hot enough to compromise the structural integrity of bunkers designed to contain exactly this kind of event. The explosions didn't stop. Every 30 to 90 seconds, another detonation, another thermal spike, another pressure wave rolling across the frozen landscape. Emergency services couldn't approach. The heat was too intense. The risk of further secondary detonations too high. All they could do was establish a perimeter and wait. By sunrise, a column of smoke was visible from over 100 kilometers away. Thermal signatures continued to register for the next 18 hours. This wasn't the first time Ukraine had struck deep inside Russian territory, but it was the largest strike by economic impact and possibly the most tactically significant. Not because of the spectacle, because of what it removed from the battlefield. The 107th Arsenal wasn't just storage, it was a critical logistics node. 3 major supply routes originated here. South toward Rostov, feeding the Donbass front. West toward Bryansk, supplying operations in Kharkiv and Luhansk. Southwest toward occupied Crimea, sustaining forces in Zaporizhia and Kherson. Intelligence assessments from Western sources later estimated the facility held 80,000 152mm artillery shells, 400 rockets for Tornado-S and Smerch systems, 160 Iskander-M ballistic missiles valued at roughly $3 million each, guided munitions for Su-34 and Su-35 strike aircraft, naval torpedoes and anti-ship mines, enough small arms ammunition to equip 200,000 personnel. Total estimated value, $950 million. Total replacement timeline, 8 to 14 months, assuming no supply chain disruptions. But there would be disruptions, because this wasn't just about destroying existing stock. It was about forcing Russia to redistribute from facilities that were never designed to handle this load. Within 72 hours of the strike, Western intelligence detected unusual activity at secondary depots across Western Russia. Convoy movements increased, railcar traffic spiked, munitions were being relocated from deep storage to forward positions at a pace that suggested urgency, not planning. The problem with urgency is that it introduces risk. Overloaded storage increases the chance of accidents. Faster transport means less time for safety protocols. Distributed ammunition is harder to protect than centralized reserves. Russia was being forced to choose between operational readiness and structural safety, and the choice was being made for them. But here's what made this strike different from previous deep strikes. It wasn't a missile. Ukraine doesn't have cruise missiles with the range to reach Toropets from Ukrainian-controlled territory. The Storm Shadow systems provided by the UK max out around 250 kilometers. ATACMs from the US could theoretically reach, but Washington has explicitly restricted their use against targets inside Russia proper. So how did Ukraine hit a target 380 kilometers inside Russian territory, defended by layered air defense systems, without using weapons they don't have or aren't allowed to use? That's the question that has Russian air defense planners recalculating every assumption they've made about safe distance. The weapon used wasn't in any NATO inventory 6 months ago. It wasn't built by Lockheed Martin or Raytheon. It was designed in Ukraine using commercially available components and assembled by engineers working in conditions most defense contractors would consider impossible. No climate-controlled laboratories, no billion-dollar R&D budgets, just necessity, technical skill, and a very clear operational requirement: reach farther than the enemy thinks you can. The system has a reported designation, though Ukraine hasn't officially confirmed it. Western analysts refer to it as polyanitsa, a type of Ukrainian bread, but also a word difficult for non-native speakers to pronounce, a linguistic shibboleth with historical significance. What matters isn't the name, it's the capability. Long-range strike, autonomous navigation, terrain-following flight profile, low radar cross-section, and most importantly, cost-effective enough to manufacture in meaningful numbers. Each unit reportedly costs between $15,000 and $20,000 to manufacture. Compare that to a Tomahawk cruise missile at $2 million or a Storm Shadow at over $1 million. Ukraine just demonstrated that you don't need the most expensive weapon. You need the right weapon, used at the right time against the right target. But building the weapon was only half the problem. The other half was intelligence, knowing what to hit, knowing when to hit, and knowing exactly where the vulnerabilities were in a facility designed specifically to prevent this kind of attack. That required months of preparation, satellite imagery analysis, signal intelligence, pattern recognition, and almost certainly human intelligence on the ground. By the time the strike was launched, Ukrainian planners knew which bunkers held the highest value targets, which structures had the weakest points, which defensive systems covered which approaches, and critically, when the facility would be at maximum capacity. Because timing wasn't arbitrary, the strike came just weeks before Russia's planned summer offensive. The 107th Arsenal had been receiving increased shipments for over 2 months. Trucks, rail cars, convoys, all funneling munitions into a single location for eventual redistribution to the front. Ukraine waited until the target was worth hitting, then they hit it. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Russian Ministry of Defense initially denied anything significant had occurred. A fire of unknown origin at a military storage facility, under control, no casualties. That narrative lasted about 6 hours. By mid-morning, commercial satellite imagery from Maxar Technologies was already circulating. High-resolution photos showing multiple impact craters, collapsed bunker roofs, thermal signatures indicating ongoing fires, smoke plumes visible from orbit. Local residents were posting videos to social media faster than Russian authorities could suppress them. Explosions, secondary detonations, emergency vehicles racing toward the facility. Within 24 hours, the Russian government shifted the story. A Ukrainian drone attack, successfully repelled, minimal damage. The satellite imagery said otherwise. By 72 hours, Moscow stopped commenting entirely. But the real impact wasn't measured in press releases or satellite photos. It was measured at the front line. Within 10 days of the Toropets strike, Ukrainian forces reported a noticeable decrease in Russian artillery fire across multiple sectors. Not a complete halt, but a reduction significant enough to be tactically relevant. Russian commanders were receiving new directives: reduce daily expenditure of artillery shells by 40%, prioritize defensive operations, postpone planned offensives pending resupply. The summer push that Russian forces had been preparing for was delayed, not because they lost soldiers, not because they lost equipment, because they lost the ammunition to sustain the operation. Logistics wins wars, and Ukraine just struck one of Russia's most critical logistics nodes. So here's what we know. A facility designed to be untouchable was destroyed. A target 380 kilometers inside Russian territory was hit with precision. $950 million in military assets were eliminated in less than an hour, and Russia's plans for a summer offensive were thrown into disarray. Not by a superpower intervention, not by a NATO air campaign, by Ukraine.
To understand why this strike mattered, you need to understand what the 107th Arsenal actually was, not just on paper, but operationally. Because calling it an ammunition depot is like calling an aircraft carrier a boat. Technically accurate, completely missing the point. The 107th Arsenal was built during the Cold War, when the Soviet Union planned for conflicts measured in months and years, not weeks. The doctrine was simple: stockpile everything you might need deep inside your territory where NATO couldn't reach it, then distribute forward when conflict began. The facility at Toropets was one of dozens constructed across the Soviet Union following this logic. But by the time Russia inherited these facilities in 1991, most had fallen into disrepair. Toropets didn't. It remained operational because of geography. Located in Tver Oblast, roughly 380 kilometers northwest of Moscow, it sat at a strategic junction, close enough to Western military districts to supply them efficiently, far enough from any border that planners considered it safe from conventional attack. 3 major rail lines converged within 15 kilometers. 2 highways provided direct routes south and west, and the facility itself had been continuously upgraded since the 1990s. Not extensively, but enough to keep it functional. By the time Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Toropets had become what military logisticians call a throughput hub, not just storage, active distribution. Munitions arrived from production facilities in the Urals, from refurbished Soviet stocks in Siberia, from purchases abroad when possible. They were sorted, inspected, repackaged, and sent forward to smaller depots closer to the front. The goal was velocity. Keep ammunition moving. Don't let it sit idle, because idle ammunition doesn't win wars. The problem with velocity is volume. To keep the front supplied, Toropets had to handle massive throughput, and that meant at any given time the facility held more munitions than it was technically designed for. Bunkers rated for 50 tons held 80. Storage areas designed for temporary holding became semi-permanent. Safety margins eroded in favor of operational necessity. Russian commanders made a calculated risk. The facility was deep inside Russia. Ukrainian forces didn't have weapons that could reach it. Therefore, overloading wasn't dangerous, it was efficient. That calculation held for over 2 years. Then it stopped holding. Let's walk through what the facility actually contained, bunker by bunker, target by target, because the strike wasn't random, it was surgical, and understanding what was destroyed tells you everything about how the operation was planned. The facility was divided into sectors. Sector A held artillery munitions, 152mm shells for D-20 and EMSTA-S howitzers, 122mm rounds for Gvozdika systems, smaller caliber ammunition for mortars and light artillery. Western intelligence estimates, based on satellite imagery analysis and intercepts, suggest this sector held approximately 80,000 artillery shells at the time of the strike. That's roughly 12 days of sustained artillery fire across the entire southern front. Not months, not weeks,
12 days, because Russia was firing between 10,000 and 20,000 shells per day, depending on operational tempo. The actual number fluctuated, but the average consumption was staggering, which meant Sector A wasn't just valuable, it was critical. Destroy it, and you force Russian gunners to ration. Ration, and you reduce suppressive fire. Reduce suppressive fire, and Ukrainian infantry can maneuver more freely. It's a chain reaction that starts with logistics and ends with tactical advantage. Sector B was rocket artillery, Grad, Smerch, Tornado-S, multiple launch rocket systems designed to saturate target areas with explosive submunitions. Each Tornado-S rocket costs approximately $120,000, each Smerch rocket around $80,000. Intelligence assessments suggested Sector B held roughly 400 rockets across various systems. Do the math, roughly $40 million in rocket artillery alone. But again, value isn't just monetary, it's operational. Rocket artillery gives Russian forces the ability to strike concentrations of Ukrainian troops before they can disperse. Destroy the rockets and you remove that capability. Force Russian commanders to conserve what they have left. Make them choose which targets are worth the expenditure. Every choice they have to make is a decision point where Ukrainian forces can exploit hesitation. Sector C was the crown jewel, guided munitions, Iskander-M ballistic missiles, KH-101 cruise missiles, Caliber naval variants, high-precision systems designed to hit command posts, ammunition depots, power infrastructure, targets where accuracy matters more than volume. An Iskander-M missile costs approximately $3 million. Western sources estimated Sector C held 160 of them. That's $480 million in Iskanders alone. But the real value wasn't the price tag, it was irreplaceability. Russia can't produce Iskander missiles quickly. The supply chain for guidance systems, propellant, warhead components, all of it is constrained by sanctions, production bottlenecks, and technical complexity. Estimates suggest Russia can manufacture between 40 and 60 Iskander missiles per year under current conditions. Destroying 160 in a single strike doesn't just eliminate existing stock, it eliminates years of future production equivalent. It forces Russian planners to decide whether to use remaining missiles now or conserve them for future contingencies. And every missile they don't use is a target in Ukraine that doesn't get hit. Sectors D and E held support munitions, anti-aircraft missiles for S-300 and S-400 systems, surface-to-air interceptors, electronic warfare pods, communications equipment, the infrastructure that makes modern combined arms operations possible. These sectors were less densely packed, but no less important, because modern warfare isn't just about shooting, it's about seeing, communicating, and coordinating. Remove the tools that enable coordination, and even well-trained units start operating in isolation. Isolated units make mistakes. Mistakes create opportunities. But there was one more element that made Toropets irreplaceable. It wasn't just what the facility stored, it was what it enabled. Toropets was a node in a network. 3 major supply routes radiated from it. Route South fed the Donbass axis. Ammunition moved by rail to Rostov, then by truck to forward depots near Donetsk and Luhansk. This route sustained the grinding, attritional fight in the east, where Russian forces relied on artillery superiority to compensate for tactical limitations. Route West supplied the Kharkiv and Luhansk fronts, shorter distances but more contested. Ukrainian forces had demonstrated the ability to strike logistics columns on this route, which meant supplies had to move faster and in smaller increments, higher risk, higher operational tempo. Route Southwest fed occupied Crimea and the Southern Front, the longest route, but also the most critical for sustaining Russian positions in Zaporizhia and Kherson. Crimea had limited local production and storage. It depended on resupply from the Russian mainland. Cut that resupply, and the entire southern axis starts to wither. Now, imagine all three routes suddenly losing their primary source. Secondary depots exist, but they're smaller, less well-stocked, and not designed to handle the entire load. Redistribution takes time. Munitions have to be moved from facilities in central Russia, transported over longer distances, routed through choke points that are now more vulnerable because the load is concentrated. It's a cascading logistics problem, and cascading problems don't resolve quickly. They compound. Each delay at one node creates delays downstream. Trucks waiting for rail cars waiting for clearance, frontline units waiting for trucks. Waiting means not shooting. Not shooting means losing initiative. Losing initiative means ceding tactical advantage to an opponent who isn't waiting, who's pressing, who's exploiting every gap you leave open. That's what made Toropets different from hitting a single ammunition dump near the front. This wasn't a tactical strike, it was a strategic one. It didn't just destroy ammunition, it disrupted an entire supply architecture. An architecture takes time to rebuild, time Russia didn't necessarily have. Because Ukraine wasn't sitting idle while Russia tried to reorganize. They were planning the next strike, and the next. And Russian commanders knew it, which meant they couldn't just focus on rebuilding what was lost. They had to defend what remained. And defense requires resources, resources that weren't infinite. Every air defense battery moved to protect a depot was one less battery protecting frontline positions. Every logistics convoy rerouted to avoid vulnerable choke points added hours to delivery timelines. Every kilogram of ammunition diverted to secondary storage was one less kilogram moving toward the fight. Toropets forced Russia into a resource allocation problem with no good answers. Protect everything and protect nothing effectively. Prioritize some targets and accept that others remain exposed. Consolidate storage and create bigger, more valuable targets. Distribute storage and lose efficiency. Ukraine didn't just destroy a depot, they created a dilemma, and dilemmas are harder to solve than problems. Problems have solutions, dilemmas have trade-offs, and every trade-off has a cost. So when Russian logistics officers sat down to recalculate their supply chains in the days after Toropets,